Welcome to our deep dive today. We're going to be exploring how global forces like international trade can have a real impact on our lives right here in our own communities.
Absolutely. That's right. It's all about learning to think and act locally, even when we're thinking about these big global ideas.
Exactly. And to guide us on this journey, we're going to be turning to the work of Milton Friedman. Now, he was a renowned economist who, back in the 1980s, created this fascinating series called Free to Choose. And in it, he traveled the globe, examining how government policies, particularly those related to trade, affected people from all walks of life.
Yeah, and what's so compelling about Friedman's work is that he doesn't just present these abstract economic theories.
Mhm.
He brings those ideas to life through real-world examples showing how global forces play out in the lives of everyday people.
Okay, so let's dive in. One of the foundational concepts that Friedman explores is the idea of the invisible hand, a term coined by Adam Smith, who's considered the father of modern economics. Now, I'll admit, when I first heard that phrase, it sounded a bit mysterious, almost magical.
It does have a certain mystique to it,
Yeah.
but at its core, the invisible hand describes how individuals, each acting in their own self-interest, can actually end up benefiting society as a whole.
So how does that work in practice?
Well, imagine a local farmer who brings his produce to the market.
Right.
He's not doing it out of the goodness of his heart. He wants to sell his goods and make a profit. But in doing so, he's providing fresh food for his community, meeting a need and contributing to the local economy.
So it's like a self-regulating system where individual actions driven by self-interest create a positive outcome for the collective.
Precisely. And this is the fundamental principle behind free trade, allowing goods and services to flow freely between countries without interference from things like tariffs or other barriers.
And Friedman argues that, just like in our local farmer example,
Yeah.
free trade allows individuals and nations to specialize in what they do best, leading to greater efficiency and ultimately more prosperity for everyone involved.
Right. And he illustrates this point by examining historical examples like 19th century Britain, which after years of heavy taxes and duties on imports made a dramatic shift towards free trade.
That period's often cited as a turning point for Britain, transforming it into a global economic powerhouse.
It is. And a key event that captured this transformation was the Crystal Palace exhibition in 1851. It was a showcase of innovation and industry, attracting exhibits from around the world and demonstrating the fruits of Britain's free trade policies.
So Britain embraced free trade, and it seemed to work out pretty well for them.
Yeah.
But did other countries follow suit?
Some did, and some took a very different path. Japan, for example, after centuries of isolation, opened up to the world in 1868, and inspired by Britain's success, also embraced free trade.
And what was the impact of that decision on Japan, especially in the context of thinking and acting locally?
It was transformative, particularly in traditional industries like weaving. The introduction of new technologies like the jacquard loom from Europe actually boosted the Japanese weaving industry, making it more efficient and competitive.
That's fascinating. We often think of technology as replacing jobs, but in this case, it seems like it actually enhanced a traditional industry.
It did. And as the industry became more efficient, workers were freed up to move into other emerging sectors, contributing to a broader economic boom in Japan. And if you look at Japan today, its weaving industry continues to thrive, producing high-quality goods at competitive prices, thanks in part to that early embrace of technology and open markets.
So Japan provides a compelling example of how embracing free trade and adapting to technological advancements can lead to positive outcomes, even at the local level. But not every country followed that path, right?
Right. In contrast to Japan, India, upon gaining independence in 1948, chose a different route, opting for central planning and government control of the economy.
And now, to be fair, this was a time when many countries were experimenting with different economic models, trying to find the best path to prosperity.
Absolutely. But it's important to examine the consequences of those choices, both intended and unintended. And Friedman does just that, visiting Anakaputhur, a village south of Delhi, where generations of weavers had been creating beautiful textiles for centuries. The Indian government, aiming to preserve this traditional industry, implemented policies to protect and subsidize handloom weaving.
On the surface, that sounds like a well-intentioned policy trying to protect a vital part of their cultural heritage.
It does. But as Friedman observed, those policies, while seemingly aimed at supporting local weavers, actually hampered the industry's growth and prevented the development of more modern manufacturing in India.
So by trying to protect the old ways, they might have inadvertently held back progress and limited the economic opportunities for people in that community.
That's the paradox. And it highlights the importance of carefully considering the long-term consequences of economic policies, even those designed with the best intentions.
It's a reminder that thinking and acting locally requires us to understand not just the immediate impacts of policies, but also their potential ripple effects on our communities over time.
Exactly. And that brings us to the American perspective on free trade, which, as you might imagine, is filled with its own complexities and controversies.
Oh, I bet. Especially since Friedman wasn't one to shy away from tackling tough issues, even in his own country.
He wasn't. And one of the ways he did this was by orchestrating a debate in Chicago, bringing together a diverse group of voices, union leaders, businessmen like Don Rumsfeld, and, of course, economists.
What a fascinating mix of perspectives. What were some of the key issues they grappled with?
Well, one of the most contentious questions was whether the U.S. should always buy goods from the cheapest market, regardless of whether those low prices were a result of foreign subsidies.
That's a debate that's still raging today. We see it in discussions about manufacturing jobs, globalization, and fair trade.
It is. And it's a perfect example of how global economic forces can have a direct impact on our local communities.
So what were the main arguments on each side of that debate?
Friedman, as you might expect, was a staunch advocate for free trade. He argued that ultimately it benefits consumers by providing access to lower prices and a wider variety of goods. He also maintained that it promotes economic freedom, allowing individuals and businesses to make choices without excessive government interference.
But I imagine there were strong counterarguments, particularly from those concerned about the impact of cheap imports on American jobs.
Absolutely. The other participants, especially the union leader, raised concerns about the potential for job losses and the need to protect American industries from unfair competition from foreign producers who might be receiving government subsidies.
So it was a clash between the ideal of a free market and the very real anxieties about economic disruption and its impact on local communities.
Exactly. And that tension is at the heart of many trade debates. It's about weighing the potential benefits of free trade, lower prices, more choices against the potential costs, particularly for those workers and industries most vulnerable to competition from abroad.
It sounds like a classic example of those global forces impacting local realities.
It is, and it raises an important question. How can we harness the potential benefits of free trade while also addressing the legitimate concerns of those who might be negatively impacted by it? In other words, how do we think and act locally in a globalized world?
That's a question we'll continue to explore as we delve deeper into Friedman's ideas.
Let's go back to that fear of cheap labor stealing American jobs, because this directly relates to how we think about our local economy. Friedman argues that the real issue often isn't foreign competition itself, but rather it's our own government's policies that can distort the market.
So instead of the invisible hand, it's the very visible hand of government intervention that can sometimes cause problems.
Yeah, exactly. He gives the example of British shipyards building vessels at a loss for the Polish government, subsidized by British taxpayers. So it illustrates how government intervention can sometimes harm both domestic industries and consumers in the long run.
That's interesting because on the surface, it seems like supporting those domestic industries would protect jobs and boost the local economy.
It might in the short term, but Friedman argues that propping up inefficient industries with subsidies ultimately hurts consumers by leading to higher prices. And this can actually stifle innovation and economic growth over time.
So by trying to protect jobs in one sector, the government might inadvertently be hindering job creation and economic development in other, more dynamic sectors.
Precisely. It's about letting the market, that invisible hand we talked about, guide resources to where they are most efficiently used. And this applies not only to international trade, but also to our local economies.
This is where it gets really interesting for me because it challenges us to think about the long-term consequences of economic policies, even at the local level.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
For example, imagine your local government offering tax breaks to attract a big box store. On the surface, it might seem like a win-win, creating jobs, boosting tax revenue. But what about the impact on existing local businesses?
Could it potentially drive out smaller retailers who simply can't compete with those artificially low prices? And what about the quality of the jobs created? Are they good-paying jobs with benefits or just low-wage jobs with limited opportunities for advancement?
Those are exactly the kinds of questions we need to be asking as citizens. It's about looking beyond the immediate benefits and considering the potential long-term consequences of those policies on our communities.
This reminds me of the buy local movement. It seems like there might be some tension between supporting local businesses and Friedman's argument for free trade. How do we reconcile those ideas?
Yeah, there's definitely a balance to strike. Friedman would argue that in a truly free market, the best products and services, regardless of where they come from, should rise to the top.
So while supporting local businesses is important, we shouldn't necessarily shy away from competition because ultimately that competition can drive innovation and benefit consumers.
Exactly. Think about a local coffee shop facing competition from larger chains. They might be more motivated to offer higher quality coffee unique blends or a more personalized customer experience in order to stand out and attract customers.
That makes sense. It's about finding ways to differentiate yourself in a competitive market and ultimately provide a better experience for consumers. But what about those workers and businesses that are inevitably displaced by that competition? What happens to them?
That's a valid concern, and it brings us back to Friedman's emphasis on creating a more adaptable workforce. He believed that investing in education and training programs was crucial to help people develop the skills they need to thrive in a dynamic economy, no matter what industry they are in.
So it's not just about protecting existing jobs, but also about equipping people with the tools they need to succeed in a rapidly changing job market. It's about investing in human capital, not just preserving the status quo.
Precisely. And this is where we can all think and act locally by supporting schools, community colleges, vocational training programs. These are investments in our community's future, and they can help create opportunities for people regardless of what happens in the global economy.
It's about empowering people to be resilient in the face of economic change. Which brings us back to Friedman's radical proposal for a constitutional amendment prohibiting tariffs and export subsidies.
Yeah, it's a bold idea that forces us to confront some fundamental questions about the role of government in the economy.
Would such a move truly unleash a wave of prosperity, as Friedman argued? Or would it lead to economic chaos and widespread job losses? It's a debate that probably won't be resolved anytime soon.
But it's a debate worth having. Even if we don't fully embrace Friedman's radical solution, his insights challenge us to think critically about how we can create a more dynamic and equitable economy both locally and globally.
It's about finding that delicate balance between promoting competition and ensuring that everyone has a fair shot at success, regardless of the global forces at play.
Exactly, and it's a journey we can all be a part of, starting right here in our own communities. Now, Friedman also had some thought-provoking things to say about the nature of competition and how sometimes what we perceive as unfair competition might actually be beneficial for consumers.
That's intriguing. It seems counterintuitive to think of unfair competition as a good thing. Can you elaborate on that?
He uses the example of the steel industry lobbying for protection against what they considered unfair competition from foreign producers, often subsidized by their governments. American steel companies were essentially asking for the government to shield them from cheaper imports.
But Friedman seems to suggest that this unfairness actually benefits consumers. How so?
He argues that if foreign governments are willing to use their taxpayers' money to sell goods below cost to American consumers, why should we complain? It means we get cheaper steel, which benefits everyone who buys products made with steel.
So he's saying those foreign subsidies are essentially a gift to American consumers.
Precisely. And he argues that those subsidies are likely unsustainable in the long run. Eventually, taxpayers in those foreign countries will start to question why they're footing the bill to provide cheap steel to Americans.
So it's a short-sighted strategy that ultimately hurts those foreign economies more than it hurts the U.S.?
That's Friedman's argument. He believed that the best way to promote a healthy and competitive steel industry was for the government to stay out of it altogether. No tariffs, no subsidies, just let the market forces play out.
So let American steel companies compete on a level playing field. And if they can't produce steel as efficiently or as cheaply as foreign competitors, then they need to adapt or find new ways to compete. It sounds like a tough love approach, but it does challenge us to think about the long-term consequences of protectionist policies.
It does. And this applies not just to steel, but to any industry that seeks protection from competition. Friedman believed that true competition isn't just about price, but also about quality and innovation.
Can you give an example of how that works in practice?
He points to Sir Freddie Laker, the British entrepreneur who revolutionized air travel with his low-cost airline Skytrain Laker, faced fierce opposition from established airlines who lobbied their governments for protection. They argued that Laker's low fares were unfair and unsustainable. But Laker ultimately succeeded because he offered a product that consumers clearly wanted: affordable air travel.
And his success forced those established airlines to become more competitive, which ultimately benefited travelers around the world. It's a classic example of how competition can drive down prices and improve quality.
Exactly. And it illustrates how sometimes the best way to promote competition is to simply get the government out of the way.
That seems to be a consistent theme in Friedman's arguments. He seems to have a deep distrust of government intervention in the market.
He does. He believed that free markets left to their own devices are generally more efficient and effective at allocating resources than government planners. But he also recognized that there are certain areas where government has an important role to play.
Such as,
Things like public safety, environmental regulations, consumer protection laws. Friedman wasn't advocating for a complete absence of government. He understood that government needs to provide certain public goods and set some ground rules for the market.
so it's about finding that balance between allowing the market to function freely and ensuring that it operates within a framework that protects the public interest.
Precisely. And that brings us back to our local perspective, because these decisions about the role of government in the economy play out every day in our communities.
Think about zoning laws, building codes, regulations on local businesses. All of these are examples of government intervention in the market.
And it's up to us as informed citizens to engage in those debates and make sure those policies are truly serving the best interests of our communities.
That's about finding that sweet spot where government action can help create a thriving and equitable marketplace rather than stifling innovation and entrepreneurship.
Exactly. And that's a conversation we need to be having constantly,
Right.
not just at the national level, but in our town halls, city council meetings, and community forums.
It's about bringing those global ideas about free trade and competition down to the local level and thinking critically about how they impact our daily lives and our community as a whole. Now, Friedman also had some interesting ideas about how to create a truly global marketplace and what the potential consequences of such a shift might be.
He did. And in our final segment, we'll explore that vision and examine whether it's a utopian dream or a recipe for disaster.
Stay tuned. Okay, so we've talked about the invisible hand, and we've debated the pros and cons of free trade. And we've even explored the idea that sometimes what seems like unfair competition can actually benefit consumers. But where does all of this lead us? What's the ultimate vision here?
Well, Friedman takes us on a thought experiment. He asks us to imagine a world without any trade barriers at all. No tariffs, no quotas, no subsidies, just a truly free flow of goods and services across borders.
That's a pretty radical idea, almost
Yeah.
utopian. It sounds like something out of a science fiction novel.
It does, doesn't it? But Friedman believed that such a world, while perhaps aspirational, could lead to unprecedented levels of prosperity and peace.
But I imagine a lot of people would push back against that idea, particularly those concerned about the impact on national sovereignty. If we're all interconnected in a global marketplace, does that diminish the power of individual nations to control their own economies and destinies?
That's a question that lies at the heart of this debate. But Friedman argues that it's ultimately individuals, not nations, who benefit most from free trade. He believed that by removing those barriers, we empower people to participate in a global economy where they can access goods and services from anywhere in the world.
So instead of being constrained by the decisions of their governments, people would have the freedom to choose what they buy and where they buy it from.
Exactly. And Friedman even went so far as to argue that free trade promotes peace, because countries that trade with each other are less likely to go to war with each other. It's that old adage, if goods don't cross borders, armies will.
That makes sense. It suggests that economic interdependence can create a powerful incentive for cooperation and peaceful resolution of disputes.
Precisely. And this brings us back to that think and act locally perspective. Even though decisions about trade policies are often made at the national or even international level, they have a profound impact on our local communities.
It's like those ripples in a pond. A trade agreement negotiated thousands of miles away can have a real impact on businesses and workers right here in our own backyard.
Think about how a change in tariffs might affect the price of goods at your local grocery store, or how a new trade deal might impact the availability of jobs in your community.
It's about recognizing that those seemingly distant global forces are actually deeply intertwined with our local reality.
Exactly. And Friedman's work, even if you don't agree with all of his conclusions, challenges us to think critically about those connections and to consider the potential consequences of our actions, both as consumers and as citizens.
So what are some concrete ways that we can think and act locally when it comes to these complex global issues?
Well, it starts with being informed, engaging in these conversations, learning about the issues that affect our communities, and making our voices heard.
That could mean attending town hall meetings, contacting our elected officials, or simply having thoughtful discussions with friends and family about these topics.
Absolutely. It's also about being conscious consumers, supporting local businesses when possible, considering the ethical implications of our purchasing decisions, and advocating for policies that promote fair trade and sustainable practices.
So every choice we make, even something as simple as buying a cup of coffee, can be a small act of thinking and acting locally in a globalized world.
Exactly. And those small actions, when multiplied across millions of people, can have a real impact.
This has been a fascinating deep dive into Milton Friedman's ideas about free trade and the power of the market. It's challenged us to think critically about the role of government, the benefits and costs of globalization, and the ways in which we can create a more prosperous and just society for everyone, both here at home and around the world.
And we hope it's inspired you to think and act locally in your own community.
Thank you for joining us on this journey of exploration and discovery. Until next time, keep thinking deeply and acting locally.